Hi, I want to make a video, a very long video on the idea of creating standards for certain situations and what you have expectations for, and how, sort of like the illusion versus reality thing, how life's an illusion, but since it's an illusion and that's the only thing we know, sort of like the psychology is the only thing we know, that's the only thing we see through, it still has its own standards in reality and how it still has an existence, even though it's just an interaction. It means something because our psychology is the thing that we exist through, and that's the only thing we have our perception through. So if we don't have our psychology, then we're not going to have anything else because that's the very thing that we're perceiving through and our reality is existing through. Even though reality exists outside of us, it's the thing that we're perceiving through. The feelings, the things, whatever physical processes that are allowing us to perceive things. Sort of like even though life's an illusion, it's one hell of an illusion, one hell of an illusion. As some famous scientist may have said, it doesn't mean it's not reality. It can be an illusion, but when the standard is that it's the illusion, it's the reality. So saying it's an illusion is almost redundant because you just say illusion is synonymous with reality because that's the very standard for which it exists. It doesn't matter if it's an illusion or if it's reality. It doesn't matter what way you describe it. It is what it is, and that's the reality that we're living in. And the better word to use, generally speaking, for the circumstance, is reality. It's a reality that we're living in. It's called an illusion all you want. It's one hell of an illusion, sort of like time passing. There's no real time. There's no real future. There's no real present. There's no real this. There's no real that. Um, Future obviously doesn't exist except as a mental construct that we're seeing and framing into the future. Memory, the only way past exists is by memory. Obviously, we can see, but we're also existing in the past because our brain processes are slow and they perceive things sensually, and we perceive things in our mind, our thoughts. We project and we interact. We perceive our environment in the past because we're always seconds behind, sort of like our movement is seconds behind because of the electrical currents that go to our legs and our nerves that move, allow us to sense and move, are always behind. So we're always constantly living in the past, physically speaking, but also memory. That's the only thing that we're living by. We're living by this conscious thing, and the consciousness thing is based on this memory, this projection, this interaction, and that's exactly what we're living off of is this interaction. So we not only interact physically in the past, but we're also we have memory that views things in the past and present. These words don't mean anything. Obviously, they're just words that have some kind of meaning. We're putting meaning to, like the interaction. I say it doesn't mean much of anything, um, but it still has some way of describing a certain situation. It's a constant flow as opposed to past, present, and future. Things are just movement. It's ethereal, ephemeral, as opposed to something that's constantly moving forward. Has a distinct past, present, future. Obviously, the future doesn't exist other than a concept. Like the word, it's describing a concept, sort of like illusion doesn't describe reality other than just making another useless contrivance about it. It's one hell of an illusion, but that doesn't mean anything beyond a certain point. It is reality, and it's just being redundant at that point because if it's by very definition, it's an illusion, and that's all reality is, then that's just reality, and you're just being pointlessly redundant and contriving some kind of other word to describe it when it doesn't need to be described that way. It's an illusion, but what's the illusion when that's all reality is? It's all an illusion, so therefore it's all illusion equals reality, and therefore it's just reality at that point. So, I mean, it's a pointless redundancy and a pointless contrivance to make that distinction. It doesn't mean much beyond that distinction that you're making. Um, I mean, a lot of these distinctions that we make are kind of frivolous and pointless, sort of like, um, as one may have mentioned in a video before, um, not me, but someone else, about, pointless interactions that we have to contrive, these contrivances that certain species have to having interactions with other people or interactions with other species and how they interact is pointless, but it's still, the interaction exists, but it's not to the it's for the sake of survival, for the sake of the purpose. We're obviously, and it has nothing to do with, we obviously indulge in those things, but it really, the things that we do to interact and do our survival purpose, to procreate, to whatever it is, the survival of our genes, our genome, and the survival of us to live long enough, the survival in general of our genome, of our sexual organs, or the thing that comes through our sexual organs, that the egg and the sperm, to have that live long enough through us, not only through us, but by having offspring and having it live off at least partially through us, because we're only, the offspring is only half of us partially, half of us, so it's moving on, at least in some way, shape, or form. By spreading it to a next generation. So it has nothing to do with that. And then the distinctions that we make, obviously, are um, pointless. Obviously, it's just interaction. You're forced into movement. once you exist. And obviously you rationalize it once it's already here. You already have a kid, and you have to rationalize it now. Therefore, you're defending something that you wouldn't have defended if you didn't make the mistake to begin with. And that's exactly what it is. Once you have the kid, doesn't mean you can't say it was a mistake. It's a mistake and you're not going to do it again. It's about prevention. Obviously, the things are already here. The kid you already had, you already procreated, therefore that mistake's been made, and it's about learning from your mistakes early on as opposed to learning them too late, beyond the reasonable doubt or beyond a certain point where the mistakes can't be learned from anymore, and it's just fatal, if you want to say that, or the mistakes will be all the more grave if you wait longer to correct for those mistakes, or the mistakes you didn't learn from to begin with. So when you create these artificial standards and these distinctions, I mean, I don't know if I'd explain that last example good enough when I'm just saying these artificial distinctions, and it really, that's the point I was making with the whole thing where you're interacting with the people, things in your species, and the pointless, frivolous nature, and how you interact with the species, or like what's needed, and if it's not conducive necessarily directly to survival. Obviously, we indulge in those kinds of things. I want this, I want that, I want more money, gold digging, things like that. We obviously indulge in those kinds of things. So it's a pointless distinction to make, I would say mostly. It's an unnecessary distinction to make. Obviously, it's an indulgence, and in the end, it's all about procreating, and whatever standards we create, not necessarily procreate. I'm not going to say it's procreating. It's all about having, say, interaction with some other thing. You're obviously, if you're interacting by its very nature, the want to interact comes before the things that you're doing to interact, right? So whatever you're doing to interact is to interact with someone else. So if you do this, whatever it may be, you're trying to get some end in the interaction that you're trying to get out of someone. So obviously it takes a want to interact before the interaction happens, or the thing that you're doing to try to achieve an interaction. So that's the very thing. It's about what comes first. You have to understand sometimes you get confused about what comes first, and you can create logical errors by not knowing exactly what comes first, sort of like making um, a person being falsely accused of something, and you don't necessarily know what they're being falsely accused of, and yet you jump to conclusions even though the very premise of what they're being falsely accused of could be based on something that actually happened, or actually didn't happen, being falsely accused of, saying that they're being falsely accused of something else, what happened, and they use, say, an example, but you don't know if it didn't happen, but you're using your own projection to think that maybe what they're saying is a lie. But you don't know necessarily, because the thing that came before that, regardless of if it's a lie or not, is the thing that creates the excuse that a person may have had to create the thing that you perceive as a lie. So it's the thing that beforehand. So you have to not confuse it beforehand and say it's apropos. This is just too much of a coincidence, when in fact the thing that the coincidence creates is the circumstance you think they're lying about. So it's the thing, it doesn't make sense. The circumstance you create is the thing you need to scrutinize first, and you need to figure out the roots of the problem, and you need to figure out what happened first, as opposed to scrutinizing the thing that you're making accusations of, because you never know. The thing that you think is a lie and you think is just apropos, is just a coincidence, could be the thing that happened, because that's the thing that they're premising, say the excuse they may have had for whatever circumstance, generally speaking, and you're attacking the excuse. You're not attacking the thing that may have happened, and you're saying, since the excuse doesn't make sense, all of a sudden the thing that happened before didn't make sense. Even though you don't know if it happened, you need to know if that happened before you can say their excuse doesn't make sense. Because the thing that you don't know didn't happen, the thing that happened before is the thing that they're premising their excuse off of. So therefore, you need to go back to seeing if that really happened before you say their excuse is false, and it's just too much of a coincidence for that to be real. So that's obviously something you have to figure out first, as opposed to just saying that, oh, their excuse doesn't make sense, even though their excuse is just too convenient. It's too coincidental, even though the thing that you're making the accusation of is the thing after they're making the after they're claiming that something that caused that excuse, and you're not attacking the excuse. You're attacking you're not attacking the thing that happened. You're attacking the excuse that they have for the thing that you don't know necessarily happened. So it's about attacking the thing that happened first and figuring that out before you attack the excuse a person's had, before you make the accusation that they're full of crap or they're lying or something about a situation. So it's about attacking that first, or figuring out, getting to the bottom of the evidence before, getting to the evidence before you make that false accusation. Because it's not necessarily apropos, because the apropos is just coming from not necessarily knowing. The apropos, like I said, making false accusations or not believing a person's excuses for doing something, or doing something that they did, and you don't realize the reason that they did them, and just making the accusation based on the excuse they have, that it just seems too coincidental about the thing that they had that happened before, that you don't know that you don't know if that happened or not. You need to figure out the real evidence if it happened or not and see if that makes sense from there, as opposed to just insulting the excuse they have for doing something and not realizing the exact reason they did that thing. Sort of like expecting, not really knowing if other life exists. Why do we exist? It's 1 in a trillion odds, right? But no, we exist, therefore the things, the coincidence that allows us to exist existed before us existing, before the idea of some kind of probability, because probability doesn't exist, it's 1 in 1. That's exactly what's happening. Our existence is 1 in 1. And once we're here, it's not 1 in a trillion odds, it's 1 in 1 odds. I know there's like an analogy that has to do with like a mud puddle, like where the mud puddle was here first. I can't exactly remember the analogy, but I think along the same lines you can understand, generally speaking, where I'm coming from. Um, why are we here? It's 1 in a trillion odds. The sun aligns exactly with the moon, and this is exactly what happens, and the heat's just right, and it's one. You could just create. It's 1 in infinity odds. But really, what that reduces to is, it's 1 infinity, 1 in 1 at that point, because it's pointless to make that distinction, especially when since once we're already here, it's not 1 in a trillion odds anymore. Since we're already here to make that conclusion, it was 1 in 1 odds to begin with, because that's the inevitability that was going to happen. If we weren't here, then obviously you can make that, but you can't do it once we're not here. So the inevitability doesn't mean much of anything at that point, because you're already here, and that's the only time you can make that that thought experiment or come to that conclusion. But obviously you can come to false conclusions, like say most people do, and they think obviously we're here, it's 1 in a trillion odds, even though the circumstance that created us came before us, and us existing is what it needs us to exist before we can come to that conclusion. So the thing that caused our existence happened before us coming to that conclusion, or coming to that false conclusion. So it doesn't matter what we think, it's going to happen anyway. It's 1 to 1 anyway. And it's the inevitability because we're already here. So it doesn't matter anyway. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. It's all just pointless, frivolous nonsense, being confused by your own internal set of logic and being confused by the circumstances. Don't confuse yourself so much that you don't realize your biases, or you're not realizing exactly a skip in logic you may be thinking, because sometimes it's just a mistake. You don't realize it. And in many circumstances, it's denial. It's denial, or just, jump in logic, or just confusing logic. Sometimes it's just those things, and you need to recognize when that's happening, and that can obviously get in the way in many circumstances, and that can be a problem. And that's about fixing those problems. And it's not always easily fixed. Sometimes it takes a chart right in front of your face of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to Z, for a person to understand exactly what's going on. So you have to evaluate the circumstances to begin with, and not just off the cuff just saying, I don't believe those circumstances because that's too convenient, based on the because you never know. That thing could have happened, and you're just going to the excuse and saying, oh, that's too convenient. He just happened to be there. That's too convenient, even though he said he was going to be there for this circumstance, and you happen to meet him there. Doesn't mean that it's completely far off. I don't think that was the best example to use. But say someone lying about a certain circumstance, and you just outright say the certain thing that they did, and you just say it's too convenient, when in reality the thing that they're doing was the thing that started the excuse that you're attacking, and that's the thing that you're saying is too convenient, even though the convenience was created by the reality that was happening to begin with. That's where you have to start realizing that that doesn't make sense. And it's not apropos or convenient by very the nature of determinism and logic. It's 1 to 1, but the very fact is that came first, and therefore that's obviously the thing that's causing it, and that's not necessarily coincidental. It's just the way that things happen to work. It's the order of operations, and it's order of logic, order of things happening, order of truth. It's the things that are happening, A, B, C, D, interactions that exist and causing one thing or another. And that's exactly what happens. I mean, it's simple. I mean, obviously I'm going in a roundabout way, and I'm going off and off and off and on and on and on about this. But it's very easy stuff. It's easy. I mean, I went over the example a dozen times. At least you should understand it. It's a very easy example. It's very easy to understand. Anyone can understand it. It's obvious. We're like cause and effect. We know the cause and effect exists, yet there's some kind of disconnection between, obviously, this happens, this is going to happen, these interactions are inevitably going to happen. We don't know the inevitability of what's going to happen, but we know something is going to happen. Even if the universe ends, that's going to happen, because that's happening. It's something that happens. But that doesn't mean anything beyond that point. Something's going to happen. There's going to be inevitability. We obviously know cause and effect. And if we know cause and effect, then we should obviously know, even though that's not necessarily the best way to describe it, there's these interactions. This happens, that means this is going to happen. This means this, all these little webs of interaction and cause and effect, in quotes, cause and effect. In an enclosed environment, to say, at the very least, bouncing a ball into a room of other balls, you can say, is my initial effect causing these other effects? But, you get the point, right? We know cause and effect, but somehow there's a distinction between that and determinism, even though the interaction that we describe with cause and effect is the very thing that describes determinism, yet people can't buy determinism. There's a disconnect between our free will and the fact that we're obviously living and moving forward, even though the moving forward is based on determinism, and that's not an illusion, that's just a fact, and using semantics to describe a situation. It's an illusion, but not really. It's an only illusion by your own standards in describing the situation in in a different way necessarily than the reality is describing it. It's obviously happening. We understand cause and effect. It's right in front of our face. It's not an illusion. It's happening. It's just the best way of describing it, or if you're in denial. It's happening, and you're part of the happening, and it doesn't need you to understand it happening. It's not an illusion. You have free will. Obviously, I'm moving, but it's only creating that false reality to begin with, that there is free will, that's creating the idea of some kind of illusion, that there is some kind of free will illusion. It's by creating that free will illusion to begin with, the falsity, the falsehood of interaction or of nature, by creating that false nature that creates the illusion, even though it's just going away from the false information and going to the truth. And that's not an illusion, that's just going away from the falsities and going more towards the truth. And that's not an illusion, that's just being honest. So it's not an illusion, it's just being more honest with yourself. So there's some kind of jump between saying something's deterministic and something is caused by cause and effect, because we obviously know I do something, it causes this and that and this and that, but obviously the thing that I did was caused by something else. We understand these interactions. I mean, we understand cause and effect. We can understand this happens, but this happened because of something else, and we can, oh, well, I mean, that means there's a chain of things happening, and that means that nothing's really cause and effect. I mean, this is simple stuff, really. It's really easy. Anyone can get it. You just have to get rid of all the other crap in the way and all the denial. I mean, the denial, that's all you can do, is to be in denial of this. It's right in front of your face. You're living the reality. You're living the cause and effect. You know it. You even accept it to an extent, and yet you're denying the real fundamental nature of existence, and that fundamental nature is a simple word. It's obviously predetermined based on cause and effect of interaction that's happened before, and it's going to lead to an inevitable end, even though we don't know right now the inevitability that's going to happen in the future. It's going to happen. Something's going to happen based on previous events, and we can come to our conclusions in our mind. We can say, obviously, okay, this is going to happen. And since sometimes we can defy our own thoughts of what we expect to happen, and it happens differently, doesn't mean there's no determinism, because we're just living inside the determinism. We can't think the determinism. We can only come to a reasonable probability, or what we can find possible or probable, the fake word of probable. And since we're living in it, we can't understand, because only if you live outside it can you see what's going to happen. If that's the only way you can possibly see it, you're not going to see it inside of reality. We're part of reality. We're projecting in our head. The projection means nothing other than another simple interaction that's happening. Our projections mean nothing because we're in the existence that's being defined by the very flow of time, ephemeral movement, sort of like there's no past, present, future. It's just a movement. There's the present, past, and obviously in the past describing physical processes and how our body moves, but it's still just movement. Past, present, future are contrivances. But yeah, understanding those distinctions in words is really everything. I was on something. I can't remember exactly what I was on. But yeah, these distinctions in cause and effect, we can understand those things. It's an easy concept. Obviously, we know moving forward based on previous events, and that those previous events are going to go into the future somehow, somewhere, some way, and it's going to be an inevitable outcome. Even if we don't know, you're inside the system, you project it. Your mind is not a projection device. You can only do it based on previous experience of probability and possibility. Probability, like I said, is a fake word. It's one-to-one. Things are going to happen a certain way. But possibility, based on our understandings of reality going forward, it hasn't been laid out yet. It's been laid out, but based on the previous events. It hasn't happened yet, though. But obviously, the happening really means very little when it's just a movement thing. We're just moving forward. The inevitability thing is just based on how things are going to interact. And there's nothing that, time is just a vague way of describing that circumstance. Things are going to interact a certain way, and things are going to happen a certain way and lead to an inevitable end. And the end is going to be the same thing that's in the beginning. It's just going to open, close, and it's going to be the thing beyond the close is going to be the very thing that happened before the open. That's all it's going to happen. A simplistic process that leads nowhere. Sort of like our lives. We live to die. We go through the pain and deprivation for no good reason when we're just going to end up in the exact same place that we started off at. And that's nothingness, really. We're not going to experience the instantaneousness of death and non-existence of experiencing nothing. And that's really the whole idea of the concept of, oh, well, I might just wake up and again. It's just instantaneous. I'll just exist again. It's just a psychological thing. Obviously, doesn't mean it, but only when it's only a concept that I can have when I exist. If I happen to think that concept, and when in reality I could never exist again. Now, the only thing that gives it context is if I exist again. But that doesn't mean since I exist now, that means I'm going to exist again in the future. It doesn't mean that. So that's another thing to describe the situations. And I guess, like I was saying before, we can't see it. We're just another interaction. We can only project by possibility. We're not a mind-reading device. We're not a projection fortune teller thing. Because if you obviously can read the future, there's no way you can read the future and not be able to change it once you know the future. Because it obviously wasn't the future if you can change it then. If you can change it, then it's not the future. And if you're inside it, that's the only way things can logically happen, is that you find it out and you can change it. Therefore, it wasn't the future then. So, I mean, even if you just give one instance, you can just see one little flashing image of something that's going to happen. That doesn't mean you couldn't change it. Even if you give one, you have an image of this is going to happen. I'm not going to tell you when or where. It's just going to happen. That's too much of a contrivance to create a reasonable expectation that it means anything beyond a certain point. Because if you're just giving one little flash image, it doesn't mean anything. It's not going anywhere. The image isn't doing anything other than saying this is going to happen. Sort of like, you can just say it really just depends on how much knowledge you know. If they just give you an image of something, obviously you can be anything. But to a certain extent, you can see, okay, I'm wearing that, so I'm not going to wear that then. Okay, I'm not going to wear that. I can change this. Obviously, I'm not going to go out naked, so why am I naked? I'm not going to wear this. I'm not going to... Okay, I'm not going to drive. I'm going to get another car now. I'm not going to drive on that freeway. I'm not going to get in a car accident. Okay, yeah, therefore it's changed all of a sudden. If you see one little image of the future, you can change it in any way possible. Wait, am I younger there? Oh, this already happened. This is a picture you took. That's the only way it can happen. Oh, you took a picture of me in the past. That was last week. Yeah, that's not happening. I just won't wear that again. I won't drive that vehicle. I won't get in the car accident. Oh, wait. Oh, this is Photoshop. That wasn't really in a car accident. Oh, okay, I see. You're full of crap. That obviously wouldn't happen. Because it hasn't been proven to happen yet, and you can't take pictures in the future. So that's besides the point. That's even that's a bad example, but obviously you can't know the future without being able to change it. Therefore, you're just another projection interacting into the future, and you can only know it when you have no interaction in the events of existence. And that means you don't exist. You either exist or you don't exist. You don't exist, you can do it, but you can't. You're not existing in the reality. But if you do exist, you're existing in the reality, and you're forced to move and do things, but you're not going to know the future because you're part of the fundamental mechanism of existence. So you're not going to do anything beyond that anyway. So, the standards of illusion versus reality, it's working. Life works because it happens to be here. That doesn't mean it's working. I mean, that's another point I wanted to make in this video. Since life is here, doesn't mean it's working. It just happens to be working. Yeah, it's working because it still exists, but it can just as easily be wiped out. Life can be just as easily eradicated. Does that mean it's not working then? No, it worked anyway. It worked and something happened to wipe it out. When it's not here, doesn't mean it didn't work. In this way, since it's here, doesn't mean it's working, but by whose arbitrary definition is it working? Time's working or movement's working, yeah, but that's the very nature of existence. That's the way it's happening. That doesn't mean it's working by whose arbitrary standards. It could not be working. You never know. You can say by whose standards it's not working because life sucks. But then you just start delving into it. It's working. It just happens to exist. Working is another contrived word where there's not really much meaning when describing the situation. It's working because it happens to exist. All of a sudden it's not working, but it worked before. Life doesn't exist anymore, but it happened to work before. But it takes that idea to have that kind of conclusion, that idea, have an idea where working can come through a mind and perceive something in that kind of concept. But then again, it's just words going through your mind. Simple interactions. Doesn't mean anything. It's called completely disconnected, but it's in the same thing. And that's just reality. And these interactions in reality boil down to one simple thing. Interactions. Nothing more, nothing less. Your descriptions mean nothing more than an interaction to come to a mutual understanding between, say, two human beings to get an idea across, to cause some other thing to inevitably happen. And that's really all these things really mean in the end. And that's the point. Just because life exists doesn't mean it's working, but by whose standards it's working. It doesn't matter arbitrary standards. It's working, it's moving, it happens to be working, but that's a standard for like illusion versus reality. It's redundant, it doesn't point anything out. Working by whose standards? It just happens to be moving forward. It's moving forward It happens to be doing what it's doing. It doesn't mean it's working. Whatever working, arbitrary standards, like I keep saying, it's working. No, it's doing. It's doing what it's doing, and that's exactly what it's doing. And that's all it's doing. It's doing what it's doing, and that's all it's doing. And there's nothing else to do except do what it's doing. And working, that's no way of describing a situation like that, because that's a useless redundancy contrivance that doesn't mean anything in describing the existence of existence. It's not working. I mean, he was alive now, and by standards of him alive, he's no longer working. He's no longer on. His brain is no longer functioning. His neurology is no longer functioning. He's no longer working. I mean, be very precise with these languages. Sometimes it really takes that precision, and it's not always there, depending on the circumstances. Sometimes you need other words to describe certain situations. And just because it isn't here doesn't mean it didn't work. It's working in describing life and how things just happen to exist, and rationalizing their existence by saying it's working because it exists doesn't mean anything beyond a certain point, because it's existing because it's doing what it's doing, and making that pointless distinction that it's working is pointless because it doesn't mean anything, because working is a bad word to use in that circumstance when describing, say, someone's arbitrary standards for what's working and what's not working. It doesn't mean it's working, or whatever other arbitrary distinctions you want to make. Just because it's here, all of a sudden it means something. It's here, therefore it's working. It has meaning. Yeah, but just something. The thing is the possibility that it can be wiped out. Everything is possible to a certain extent. Obviously, not the contrivances we create, but life can end. We understand that my life can end. That means all people's lives can end. Therefore, life isn't going to work anymore. The possibility for it not to work, or based on our very thin arbitrary standards of saying on, life off, we can say that's not going to work, because we could say, since I know I can be, people have been eradicated in the past, I can be eradicated, so therefore everyone else can be eradicated. Therefore, does that mean life can't work? It doesn't mean life can't work. It just means it's not going to exist anymore. Since it's possible for the thing to stop working or stop existing, it doesn't mean it can or cannot work. It's a bad word to describe a situation like that. So it's the possibility of life existing or not existing, and so on. In any circumstance you can describe anything like that. That's a good way of describing it, I guess. So I've babbled on long enough, so I think if I have anything else to add, I can always add it in a later video. So thank you, and I hope I didn't babble on too long, because this video is 27 minutes and 27 seconds. So thank you, and until next time, bye.